Mr. DiCarlo?
Washington. Mr. Vargas is talking.
Okay, so Mr. DiCarlo here? We're going to get started. Thank you all. I want to now introduce our second panel. Our first panelist is Mr. Cedric Alexander with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers. Our second panelist is Mr. Bob Metzger with the Pasco Police Department, the chief there. Our third panelist is Mr. Evan Bernick of the Institute for Justice. Our fourth panelist, who hopefully will arrive soon, Mr. John DiCarlo with John Jay College. And our fifth and final panelist, someone I actually met in our hearing in Missouri, Miss Pamela Means, who is the president of the National Bar Association. I would like for each of you to raise your right hand and swear or affirm that the information that you're about to provide to us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Alexander, please proceed. You each have 7 minutes. The lights will let you know when it's time to end.
Thank you very much, and I promise you I won't take that much time in the interests of and respect everyone's time here. But let me start by saying this is that I've been in policing for over 38 years now and have worked in a variety of environments both at the local, state, and federal level. Policing today is at a crossroads in its history. As we all well know, there has been a long history of separation between police and community ever since the beginning of time, and that continues to this day. However, I think it's important to note, too, that much progress has been made as it relates to police and community relations in light of many of the things that we see and hear and talk about here today. I think that for myself and the time that I've spent and currently as public safety director in a major county in Georgia and serving as president of Noble and also as one of my prior colleagues up here, Mr. Smoot, serving on the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, really gives me an opportunity to share from a variety of positions my thought in terms of how and where I think police is going as we continue to move into the 21st century. We are beginning to see, quite frankly, as we talk about police officers and their training, training is a very important aspect. I'm quite sure that we all can adhere to and say that's important to officers doing their jobs. But we're seeing also a very different officer today. Many young people who are coming on this job are not here to stay 20 and 30 years. Many of these young people may stay anywhere from 3, 5 to 7 years and may move on to another profession. So by the time that they begin to adapt to this profession, for many of them, they will have opportunities to move on. And we are also seeing many young people today, too, who are far more educated than in the past, which allow them opportunities to do many other things. And I think we also have to take into account for almost over the last 10 years as well, too, as we've seen a very struggling economy in this country. A lot of men and women, and this is more anecdotal observation than it is scientific, and from talking to a number of officers both in my department and across the country as well, too, many young people have gone into law enforcement not necessarily because that's something they wanted to do, but many of them needed a job. And they found themselves in a very noble profession in which they end up having a great deal of fondness about, and many have stayed. But as we're beginning to see the economy begin to turn around, I'm beginning to see in my own department young men and women who are deciding to go after their careers in which they started off to do in college anyway. So I think all those things are great. I just think that for us, as we begin to talk about policing in the 21st century, I think it becomes important that we also have to look at generational differences. And one thing that I am very challenged by that I hear so often is that when we talk about challenging in policing, it is so easy to paint everyone with the same brush, and I would ask that we all caution ourselves to that, and I say that to my friends and colleagues across the country because all police officers are not the same. There are those out there who are doing this job every day, and they do it very well. They save countless lives. Unfortunately, those are the stories that we may not hear about. but usually the most egregious and grotesque stories we do hear about on a frequent basis. And then we tend to want to castigate the whole police department as being a horrific profession. But I think it's important to note as well, too, that we're asking police to do more today than we ever had in the history of America as well. We're asking them to know about this and to be experts in that and to do all the things in which no one individual for $30,000 a year starting salary, quite frankly, is going to be able to do. And that's just the hardcore facts of it all. So, yes, we can train, but we also put police officers in a position, quite frankly, where we're really asking them to do a lot. And we're asking them to solve all of this nation's social issues that began before they were born, that continue to exist today, and will continue to exist when they leave the profession, either through resignation or retirement. We are going to have to change policing. We're going to have to change our attitude towards policing in terms of what the job is and how complex it is. We're going to have to train our officers. We're going to have to, first of all, we're going to have to recruit the right kind of people for this job. That's first and foremost. What do they look like? And when you're able to do that, when we say we want better trained officers, we want more educated officers, we want officers to be experts in mental health, we want officers to be experts in education, we want officers to be experts in virtually every other profession that's out there. And to make sure that I'm protected as well, too. And when I call you into my community because someone is selling drugs or shooting late at night, I want you to fix that. And if you do that job in a way that I may not particularly like, I'm going to have something to say about it. Now, that is a very challenging feat, but that is what we are confronted with in 21st century policing. And it's how do we go forward? And I will ask you all, as I will ask, and this is more probably a rhetorical question than anything else. But for the last several months, beginning back last year, the President of the United States put together a task force to look at how do we advance policing going into the 21st century. A document was put forth to the President with 59 recommendations and a number of action items divided into 6 pillars. And each one of those pillars outside, many of those pillars outline many of the issues that you have talked about thus far this morning, and we're going to talk about tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. But within that document, what you will find, quite frankly, is an opportunity for us to jumpstart policing in a real positive way, in a way that's going to be meaningful and helpful and not start over again. But starting from pillar 1, building trust and legitimacy, right down to pillar 6, where we talk about police well-being. Police well-being is how we recruit, how we provide psychological training for police officers, or psychological support, I should say, for police officers. We are putting our men and women every day in very high-stress situations. And in light of all that we have seen over the last number of months, shootings and incidents that we all question, that we know, quite frankly, based on our all observation and experience, just downright wrong. But a system in this country still has to adjudicate that, and we'll trust that they'll make the right decision.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you.
Chief Metzger?
Thank you very much. Is this on?
It doesn't sound like it. Try it. No, try it again.
Is it on now? Okay.
Yeah, put it a little closer to your...
Okay. Well, I want to thank the panel for inviting me here today. I'd like to say I'm not going to just read my script. You've already got that and have read it. What I'd like to say, though, is I've been in the business for 40 years. I've seen a lot of change in police work, some good, some bad. I'd like to echo what my partner next door to me said. I have read the President's statement on 21st century policing. I found it very interesting and enlightening. I think it is a good start to what we have to do. I also, one of the earlier panelists, talk about Guardian, and that, of course, is part of that panel. And Sue Rohr, who is the director of our training academy in the state of Washington, was instrumental, I'm sure, in putting that concept into it. But I'd also like to talk about what it takes to be a police officer. And as has been stated, there's a lot there. I listened to the previous panel, and there's a lot of training that needs to be done. But how much time can we give? An officer works 2,000 hours a year. How much of that time can we spend in training? That's a concern. I'm not saying we can't do it. I'm just saying it's a concern. we in the city of Pasco changed our schedule so that we have a training day built in, so we don't have to pay overtime to do that. That was very important to us in our training. We also were able to get a building downtown so that we could, again, conduct training. I think that's very important. We also talked about national minimum standards. I don't think that's a bad idea, but what are those standards, and how do those standards transcend all of the police departments that are out in the country? That would be a challenge, but it's certainly something that I think we could probably do. I also agree with one of the panelists who said leadership is the issue, and I agree with that, and I'm one of the leaders. I've been a police chief for over 23 years in 5 different departments. And they're absolutely right that it's up to leadership. In fact, I was speaking to the COPS office earlier this week about doing an assessment of our department, just to see where we are in terms of our community relations with our department. And it starts with a leader. If I don't tell my staff what needs to be done, it's not going to be done. As an example of that, we have 2 officers that are on administrative leave are being charged with crimes. And so we do not put up with that, and that's not a standard that we accept within my organization. I'm not talking about the shooting that is still under investigation. I'm talking about other things that have gone on within the department. So we set a very high standard. I believe in my career and in my life, police work has a higher standard, and I believe that we have to set that as leaders. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say the leader has to go, but I do believe the leader has to accept responsibility, as I have, and then move forward, realizing all the other moving parts. But there's also a need to support the staff when they do right. And as we all know, most of what happens in police work is done well. We have a lot of victims out there to crimes in all parts of the community that have done very well. In my case, the city of Pasco, we went from a high crime rate 20 years ago to a very, very low crime rate here in the near. And we did all that without necessarily arresting everybody, and certainly without hurting everybody, but working with our community. We established community policing stations. We've established a lot of community policing activities that have not only created lower crime rates, but have also created a better relationship with the community. Is it perfect yet? Probably not, and probably could use some change, and I'm certainly willing to sit down with anybody that does that. I think another thing from leadership that sometimes we lack, or sometimes not lack, but we forget about, and I certainly have to remind myself from time to time, is we're not infallible as leaders. None of us are. We all make mistakes. We also have to realize that because policing is a constantly evolving process, that we have to be ready for those changes. And I think one of the things in listening to the prior panel and what you're doing here today is one of those opportunities for me, certainly as a leader, to listen, observe, take some of these things back to my department when I go back and do that. We meet 3 times a week with all of my command staff, and they're given very clear direction from me as to what type of policing we're going to do in the city of Pasco. And I think that needs to be in every city. But I can also tell you, having been a chief in 5 different cities, that every city is different. And there is no cookie-cutter approach to policing in any one city. And it's all different. And I have to make sure that I take my background and experiences and not try to cookie-cutter them into the city that I'm in now, but rather take what I've learned and try to adapt it within the city of Pasco and learn from the city of Pasco. Another thing I'd like to talk about is that I personally, and I don't think any police chief out there, condones police misconduct. What is police misconduct, though? And that's something that is very evident sometimes, and at other times maybe not so clear. And it's something that we have to address certainly internally. But we also have the issue, and this has been brought up quite a bit by other panels, is the process for justice can take time. In all of our cases that we've had in the city of Pasco, it's taken several months for the investigation to be concluded. The DOJ is overseeing it. We talked to the FBI. We're an open book in terms of how the investigation goes, and I think that's important, and we'll certainly continue that knowledge. I certainly, as a leader, have talked to my partners in the FBI and the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, and have let them know that when they're ready to come in and do their investigation, they're more than welcome. And I think that, again, as a leader, is important. If there are deficiencies, we need to clean them up. If there aren't, then I think the public needs to know that, so hopefully they'll have a better understanding, and hopefully we can begin building or rebuilding those bridges that have been hurt or damaged, if you will, during this process. I'd also like to say that there is a difference between, I know there's been some comments made about how long it can take for an officer to be interviewed, and I know that was brought up by the last panel. In my case, I've been advised by both the prosecutor and our labor attorney to not allow the officers to be interviewed until the criminal investigation is done. They've all got attorneys, and so that has to be worked out through that process. And I realize you're saying, you're going to tell me, well, why didn't you do it quicker? I'm being advised, and that's what I have to go by. So again, we all get advice. One of the things that I'm doing is we've also sought the advice of outside experts in the use of force to look at not only our training program, but this incident as well as others, to see what we can do as a police department to deal with these situations to make sure they don't occur again. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my other panelists, and I look forward to the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Burnick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for inviting me here today. I'm fighting off a bit of a cold, but hopefully that won't pose any significant impediment. How could that happen in this country? It's a question that many Americans are asking themselves. It's a question that many Americans are asking themselves in the wake of the tragic and horrific deaths of Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Eric Harris, and others. It's a question that the Institute for Justice is familiar with. In 2005, we litigated the case of Kelo v. City of New London, which dealt with the question of whether a private developer, exercising the power of eminent domain, can bulldoze an entire working-class neighborhood for so-called economic development. The Supreme Court said yes, and Americans were outraged. How could that happen in this country, they asked. Now, Suzette Kelo, who lost her land, might not seem to have much in common with Eric Garner, who lost his life, but both were the victims of unchecked government power. When you see unchecked government power, you see people losing their liberty, their property, and even their lives. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most potent sources of unchecked government power in this country today, an example of judicial policy making that makes it effectively impossible for police officers to be held accountable for constitutional violations. In what follows, I will summarize, criticize, and call for the abolition of qualified immunity. Section 1983, the federal law that enables citizens to sue for constitutional violations, is broad, unequivocal, and unambiguous. It says that every person acting under color of law who causes a deprivation of any right secured by the Constitution and laws shall be liable to the party injured. Shall be liable. Section 1983 embodies a foundational principle of justice that resonates with Americans who have never heard of Marbury v. Madison. Where there is a right, there is a remedy. But for decades now, we have had rights without remedies. In the 1967 case of Pearson v. Ray, the Supreme Court held that police officers sued for constitutional violations can raise qualified immunity as a defense and thereby escape paying out of their own pocket, even if in fact they violated the Constitution. This decision was unabashedly policy-oriented. It was thought that government officials would not vigorously fulfill their obligations if they could be held accountable for actions taken in good faith. Under current law, the general rule is that victims of rights violations pay the costs of their own injuries. In practice, qualified immunity provides a near absolute defense to all but the most outrageous conduct, and sometimes not even that. The Ninth Circuit has held that throwing a flashbang grenade blindly into a house isn't outrageous enough. Just last year in Plumhoff v. Ricard, the Supreme Court decided that firing 15 bullets at a motorist is a reasonable method to end the motorist's flight from the police. So much for every person shall be liable. Qualified immunity shields police misconduct not only from liability but also meaningful judicial scrutiny. Private lawsuits are an essential tool in uncovering the truth about police misconduct. The discovery process can yield information that makes broader policy changes within police departments possible. At trial, genuine judicial engagement, an impartial, evidence-based determination of the constitutionality of the officer's actions can take place. Qualified immunity can cut this search for truth short. If qualified immunity is raised as a defense before trial and a judge denies it, that decision is immediately appealable. If it is granted, discovery stops, and there is no trial on the merits. Now, what needs to happen? Simply put, qualified immunity must be abolished. It should be replaced with a rule of strict liability for bona fide constitutional violations. There are a variety of ways to get there. First, officers can be held personally liable for any rights violations and pay out of their own pockets. They'd carry personal malpractice insurance, just like lawyers, doctors, and other professionals. Second, police departments could be held liable for rights violations by officers, and punitive damages could be assessed against individual officers out of their own pockets for particularly outrageous conduct. Third, police officers could be held personally liable, but police departments could be required to insure them up to a certain amount. After that, they'd be paying out of their own pocket. They could also be criminally prosecuted for particularly outrageous conduct. Now, to be clear, these are only ideas. The question of how to ensure that officers exercise the power delegated to them with the proper vigor, while also keeping that power in check, should be left in the first instance to elected officials, within the limits of the Constitution and federal laws like Section 1983. Qualified immunity flouts those limits and those laws. It cannot be saved. It should not be saved. We must replace the judicially created impunity that police officers currently enjoy with a realistic avenue for the vindication of constitutional guarantees. This can no longer happen in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernick. Ms. Means?
Thank you, Commission. Is it on?
I believe so, yeah.
Thank you, Commission,
Now try
for
it
having
again.
us here.
It's got to be up.
Thank you, Commission, for having
There
us
you go.
here. My name is Pamela Means. I'm president of the National Bar Association. And we believe that what you're doing here today is going to make a real difference in continuing to shed light on what has become America's epidemic. There are some positions in our country and in our society that require at least the illusion of impartiality. Judges and police officers who enforce our laws are among those positions. If we trust an individual to have the authority to take away a person's freedom or even their life, we want to have all the assurances possible that you will not do that based on your negative feelings about a person's race and ethnicity. San Francisco public defender Jeff Atcher said that police departments suffer from a culture of racial and prejudice bias that need to be exercised. Then he ended his comments by saying, how do you legislate racism? The National Bar Association's response is, you cannot. You can't pass a law that will make someone like someone. You can't pass a law that will make someone trust someone. As a result, the National Bar Association is putting forth, we don't believe that the laws that we're asking to be implemented is all of the solution, but it is absolutely a part of the solution to what we believe is the problem. Because we believe you can't legislate racism away, because we believe that at the core of the problem of policing that we see is a broken educational system and the failure of this country to deal with the issue of racism. And so we believe that laws should be passed that weed out individuals that don't deserve to be on the force. Eliminate them from the beginning or keep them in the police squad until they're ready to hit the field. The laws we're offering, you may say, why did you separate them on the level you did? Well, we know if you put too much in one bill, it'll never get passed. So there were some things that we looked at the local level and said, these are the things that can be immediately passed by a city council. Stricter mental health testing. You heard it say it here today. What does that look like? There is psychological testing in some locations for that weeds in and weeds out biases. However, there's also tests on the internet that tells you how to pass those tests. There should be a standardized strict test that looks at those issues and deal with racial biases. And individuals that have a propensity toward it should not be given a gun to go on the street. They can stay in a squad room and answer calls, because this is a matter of life and death. Stricter mandatory de-escalation of force training. We've talked to officers across the country who have said we get trained on that. But when you see the flurry of videos that came out this weekend where white cops are confronted with white individuals, and instead of drawing their guns, they're backing up from them, and they're not immediately going to shooting. But when you see individuals in the African American community where the first response is actually to draw the gun and to shoot, that tells you there is a different style of policing within diverse communities and white communities. Prime example, when a white man in South Carolina can go into a Walmart, steal a cash register, terrorize the store, lead the police on a high-speed chase, take his gun, try to struggle with it, and the cop tasers him But a black man standing in a Walmart in Ohio is on the phone with his girlfriend, and there are immediate shots fired. That tells you there's a difference in policing. Mandatory race-based training. And I'm not just talking about give a course and do some simulations. I'm talking about to get to the heart, because you've heard the stories of the emails that have come out from the 14 officers in San Francisco. But what about the gentleman in West Charleston, in West Virginia, where he dressed his daughter up in his police outfit and had her dancing around to the national anthem of the Ku Klux Klan? And then his response was, I should not be fired, because if you put my racism on a scale, my racism at a 10, and other people in the department is at a 20 or 30. So on that local level, mandatory mental health testing, strict racial training, and also de-escalation of force training. On a state level, we're seeing independent investigations of police-involved shooting, independent prosecution. We do not believe that a sister organization can investigate unless they're willing to, and they go through the testing of actually saying that there is no relationship with that department, and there's a weeding out in the law of anyone that is connected with them. We don't believe in the case of the prosecutor that it's necessarily the prosecutor that's the problem. But the real problem here, you all, and the reason we fear that in South Carolina, even when you see with this video that Officer Slager may get out, is because of the law that was established in Tennessee versus Gardner. That law says that an officer can elevate force to that degree which he or she believes is reasonable to stop the force that's in front of them. You heard these panelists talk about it. Why does an officer say? Why do they say, I fear for my life? Because Tennessee Gardner gives you the right to say that. It is a script. And we fear that when a standard is that subjective, that can only be changed by the federal government. You see a lot of body camera laws, but we caution you to say that's not enough. Put some accountability on those body camera laws. Make it a felony for an officer to tamper with the law. When you hold people accountable and they have the possibility of losing their freedom, it will change how they act. Lastly, make it a felony for another officer to stand next to an officer, see them commit police brutality, and don't do a doggone thing about it. That's why we said that Officer Habershammer should be arrested, because he stood there and he saw or at least heard something fall on the floor, and his report said nothing about it. Really quickly, if we didn't have the video camera in South Carolina, the narrative that was told for 3 days by the police department, the National Bar Association doesn't applaud that department, because what they said, it was a traffic stop gone bad, until we saw video to the contrary.
Thank you, Ms. Means. If we could, appreciate the audience participation, but we don't want to have comments during the presentation, so we don't want disruption, but we appreciate your expressions. I'm going to start at the first questions, and I'll ask my colleagues to join in. Chief Metzger, there was a question that was rhetorically asked by Mr. Vargas during his presentation. I'll put it to you. Do you recognize that you have a problem in the Pasco police force?
I believe every police department has a problem. Yes, we have an issue, sure, and we're dealing with it.
And what do you see that issue to be?
I believe we are training, certainly, mental health. Let me also add that we have a mission in town.
A what? I'm sorry.
Mission. We have a Union Gospel mission in town, which has a lot of mentally ill people in it. We deal with mentally ill on a regular basis. Do we have enough training? Probably not. We've been looking for other. We also have a very large methamphetamine problem in my area. Not that I'm sure other areas don't. And in the cases that we've had, the methamphetamine has certainly added on to the mental health, makes it very difficult. Our training is always in how do we deal with the mental health, but when you add the methamphetamine into it, it changes the whole dynamics of what goes on within that process, and it's very hard to train officers on somebody like that. In one case, we had a meth addict who pulled the taser out after being tased. We do carry both pepper spray and taser, neither one of which are effective on a lot of people that are under the influence of methamphetamine. And that does change that dynamic to some extent.
And let me just say, I appreciate your being here, when our Missouri Advisory Committee held their hearing in St. Louis County, the Ferguson police officer, chief of police, refused to participate or even talk to me to see if we could get some agreement. So I do appreciate that you're here
Thank you.
and that you're answering our questions. So that does not go unappreciated or unnoticed. Now, earlier you also said how much time can you actually spend to train the police officers in terms of their interaction. My question would be, how much time can you not afford to spend? I mean, you've got to take whatever time it needs, it seems to me, to avoid deadly force encounters gone wrong. So what other things are you doing or are you planning to do to address that? I know in your remarks, that your written remarks talked about some crisis intervention training, but it sounds like not all officers, only most officers are going through that. Could you talk a little bit more about how you intend to improve that?
Be glad to. There are 2 crisis intervention trainings in the state of Washington. One is a 40-hour training, and that's to train to get people involved in a team effort, utilizing other police departments. And so we have sent some officers to that. It's a week-long training. We then have a 3-hour basic training that we've put all officers through. The only ones that were not are ones that might have been on vacation or off sick that day. So I think we have all but 3 or 4 of our officers have been trained in that. We are bringing that back. We also contacted, there's a local doctor, mental health doctor, because one of the issues we've run across is, and I'll go back a little bit, when I started police work 40 years ago, mental health issues are pretty simple for us to deal with as police officers. We could arrest them and take them in for 3 days, and the hospitals are readily available. That all changed in the 80s, and when we don't have that anymore, we can't just lock them up. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just, that's a fact. We can't do that anymore. And so a lot of them are left out for us on the street to have to deal with. And they all have various levels of mental disabilities. And so we're dealing with those, like I say, on a fairly regular basis in our case. But we're trying, so we're bringing in people from the mission to talk about what they're seeing in there. We're bringing in other health professionals. We just opened up a new 13-bed unit that's going to cover the entire southeast part of Washington to be able to take mental health people that we find on the street who are not a danger, who are simply going through issues with mental health, and try to get them some kind of services. Part of the problem is that we're finding, at least in our areas, mental health services, just like all of us, are strapped for cash, and they don't have the services that I know I had when I started 40 years ago to at least have the doctors and nurses and other professionals out there. So that lack of mental health, and I'm not blaming mental health, it's just their funding has gone down just like everybody else's. And it's just very difficult to get that sorted, but we're trying to utilize them to come in and talk to us about the issues that we're seeing. And of course, we debrief after every incident we have to see what we can do better and maybe try to, and we do have dash cams. We're the only ones in the Tri-City area, that includes other cities across the river, that have dash cams. So we do also have that availability to look at that and try to determine what we could do better.
Now, a couple more questions for you before I turn it over to my colleagues. In referring to the local federal officials and some of the other law enforcement, you referred to them on several occasions as my partners. And then you're telling us that you're being told by these partners that you can't interview the individuals involved in this criminal case for a criminal investigation till after the investigation's done. So twofold there. Do you think that there is some sort of inherent conflict when you're dealing with people who you already work with as partners to independently look at an issue like what happened to Mr. Zambrano? And secondly, don't you have some discretion of your own? You're conducting a criminal investigation. You should, as the investigator, decide when you need to investigate and who you need to ask when, shouldn't you?
Yes, and let me clear it up. I'm not talking about the federal partners. What I'm talking about is our prosecutor and our labor attorney.
Same question, though, right? Your prosecutors aren't the county prosecutors?
Right, right. And he has asked us that it would impair the criminal investigation if we were to interview the officers before, if we do our Garrity interview before we do the Miranda interview. Our labor attorney then, being not the union labor attorney, I'm talking about the city's labor attorney, has advised us that to interview the officers before the criminal investigation is complete is not appropriate and would interfere with our ability to, for example, terminate later on if we had to under Washington state labor laws. So that's what I'm talking about when when I talk about who's advising me.
So who's conducting the actual criminal investigation in this
Criminal
matter?
investigation is being conducted by, we call it our Special Investigations Unit. This is made up of officers from the other police agencies, not one agency, but several. There's about 14 officers involved in it. Everything from this investigation is turned over to them. We have an MOU, a protocol that's been set up, so none of my officers are involved in the investigation. It's strictly the officers from that SIU, and then the FBI. They're not part of that MOU. That's a separate instance. I have asked them to come in to oversee that, to make sure that the integrity of the interview, or the integrity of the process, if you will, is not questioned by anybody.
So you, probably like all of us here, you've seen that video, Mr. Zambrano, many times. And, you know, I remember when I first saw that video, there was some news commentary saying, well, you know, the guy was throwing rocks. And then you look at some of the other cases around the country, oh, he stole cigarettes, or he was selling fake cigarettes. And, you know, sometimes the victim is not necessarily the most upstanding citizen, but does that give police officers the right to use the kind of deadly force that you see in the video, in particular in Pasco? What are your thoughts about that video when you saw it?
My thoughts, like everybody, I was in horror when I saw it, and I saw it probably right away that night while I was still at the scene, when I got called out to the scene. And certainly, if that's all there is to the investigation, but we're going to end up with 68 witnesses, thereabouts. We've got 40 videos, including in-car videos. We have many other videos. So what you have there is 20 seconds of an event that I'm assuming, and I don't know all the facts yet because it hasn't been completed, but an investigation, or an incident rather, that took place over the course of about 10 to 15 minutes, of which that 20 seconds is kind of the end, if you will, of that whole investigation. Again, as a chief of police, I try not to jump to conclusions. Years ago, and I'll give you a quick example if I could, years ago, before we had cameras and everything else, when I started police work, we didn't have even computers, quite frankly. So, but I get a call to a person's house, and they said this person, they saw somebody climbing in a back window. So I go in, sure enough, there's somebody in the house. We catch the person. It's a young lady. She said, oh, this is my mother's house. Well, the name was different. Mother just moved into the neighborhood. Didn't have cell phones back then. Neighbor next door saw it going in. If that's all I took, was just that, okay, she broke into that house and didn't do anything else, she'd be in jail. As it was, there was just something about her. I said, we got to do more investigation. We checked her out. It turned out later on, yes, in fact, that was a daughter. She was in college, had come home. Mother didn't know it, didn't have a key, had come in through a bathroom window that she knew her mother always left open. So again, it's that piece of the investigation. One thing I've learned over 40 years is you just never know what all the information is going to show. It's very time consuming, and trust me, as a police officer, there's nothing worse than sitting back, or as a police chief, sitting back waiting for all that information to come forward. But until I get all that, I don't think I'm doing a service to my community, my police department, or police in general by jumping to conclusion based on a 20-second video. That video alone, yes, it's not good, and I'm not going to try to defend it, or the officers that did it. But there's a lot more to the investigation. When it all comes out, then all that has to be taken into consideration when both the prosecutor decides what to do criminally and what I decide to do within the department.
I would be surprised if any video prior to what we saw in the last 20 seconds would justify what we saw in the last 20 seconds, but I would hope that whatever other video you have would be made public so that we could assess that. But let me ask you this one, and then so when you caught the person who entered that home, could you tell me what the race or ethnicity of that person was?
It happened to be it was a black female.
Okay. Did that affect your decision in any way?
Not at all.
Do you believe that there is at least some sort of subconscious bias that may exist in police departments that may treat African American or other minorities differently in scenarios like that than non-minorities?
I think everybody has some innate problem with that, if you will, not just police departments. I think people in general, unfortunately. So to say, no, there's absolutely none, no, I'm not going to say that. Do we try to temper it? Absolutely.
And what is it that your police force does to try to temper that?
Yours
in particular.
Mine in particular. We have an outreach in the community. We have policies, rules, and regulations. I know one of the panelists, or I think somebody up here, was talking about if somebody sees something, they have to turn it in. If they don't, that's a rule violation. We have.
What about specific training for your officers, though?
Specific training for my officers.
Cultural sensitivity, language,
we do
access.
all the cultural sensitivity. We have language, because about a quarter of our officers are fluent in Spanish. And so we have them do some of the basic commands in Spanish. We each carry a cell phone, so we have a language line that we can use. And then we also make sure that our bilingual officers are spread out throughout the districts and throughout the shifts, so that there's always one available to come and assist or to make a phone call or whatever needs to be done to help out those officers that don't have that bilingual skill.
Do you know if that happened in the Zambrano case?
It did not.
Why not?
There was enough time. And one of the officers there was a Hispanic officer.
Did he speak Spanish?
He did not.
Thank you. Commissioner Cladney?
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel, anybody who wants to talk about, and first to Chief Metzger. Does your jail provide most of the mental health services in your city?
Yes, we have a county jail. I don't have anything to do with that, and yes, that's where that's
Okay,
provided.
so you have one jail for the whole county.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. And do you take a lot of people into that jail on 48-hour holds and things like that?
For,
Mental health?
no.
No, you just
Very
take them
few.
directly to the hospital?
There has to be some kind of criminal activity before we take
Okay.
them in. We don't just take them in for mental health.
Right, but they don't go. They don't go to the mental health center. They go to the jail. Is that correct?
Well, if it's a criminal, we'll take them to jail. If it's a mental health, we do have places we can take them.
Have you ever heard of an early intervention system?
Yes,
You don't have one in your city?
we do not.
Is that because you're a small department?
Small department and just don't have the personnel and the ability to be able to do that.
Do you believe that your investigation should be made public? This
It will be when it's all completed, but sure.
is that the law, or is that just your
It's,
philosophy?
part of it's a law and part of it's my philosophy. What'll happen is, just so that you're aware, is when this is all done, the prosecutor will make this available. He'll do a conference, whatever he decides, and then it's always available under Washington State public records laws. All of that will be available, all the videos, testimony, everything.
And I saw your press conference after the incident. What is your policy on use of deadly force? You said it was down at the clerk's office, and I didn't go get it.
Well, you could have.
I'm sure I could.
It's online now, too.
It is?
It is online.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. One quick question for Chief Metzger, and then one that'll be for Metzger and then for everyone else. I'm very curious about the advice that your attorneys have given you about the officers being questioned. And I'm especially curious because if I heard your testimony correctly, the FBI is somehow involved in this investigation? Is
No,
that
they're
true?
not really involved. They're just overseeing it. They've been in contact.
What's the difference between overseeing it and being involved?
They've been in contact with the investigators from the other department.
And have you advised the FBI that it's your policy not to interview these folks until the very, very end of the investigation?
Yes, I have.
And did the FBI?
That's for the civil.
It just seems to be contrary to what the FBI has done in every other case that we've talked about or alluded to in the cases here, whether it's Michael Brown, whether it's Eric Garner, whether it's Trayvon Martin. Why is it that the FBI in this case, if you know, has said it's okay?
I don't know. See, just to make sure the panel understands, the way we run the Special Investigations Unit is I am not in charge of that. That's an independent investigation of my department. I did ask the FBI to come in. I asked the DOJ to come in. They made contact. I don't know what their contact has been with the Special Investigation Unit. Again, I am not interfering or involved with
So
that.
you don't know if the FBI has actually asked to interview these officers or not?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Did you have a quick?
Yes, if I could, just for a second, to clarify this. When they talk about your department interviewing them, you're talking about that for the civil service action or any contemplated civil service action. As far as the criminal investigation goes, do you know whether they've been investigated or not, or interviewed or not, or whatever? I mean, I'm sure they've been interviewed by now.
I don't know if they have or not.
Right.
I don't believe they have yet. I think they're going to be this week.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify who was interviewing them for what reason, that's all.
Yeah, thanks. When you were talking about there's something that was sort of resonating in my mind when you were talking about how much time can I devote to training, how much can I deal with the issues of trying to get my officers to be able to speak Spanish. How do I get them to deal with issues of the mentally ill? And it goes to me to the question raised by the first panel, which is the reflection of the police force being a reflection of the community itself, whether in diversity, whether in residency. And I'd like to get your thoughts and then the thoughts of others as well, because this is becoming, to me, an increasingly important point. You know, first of all, what are you doing in terms of attempting to, or if you are doing anything, I shouldn't presume, with regard to diversifying your police force, not just in terms of whether they can speak Spanish or not, but whether or not they can be representative of the neighborhoods or the communities that you're going to have to police. And secondly, you know, to the others here, to Mr. Alexander and to Ms. Means, I want to throw that open to you as well, to how important is that diversity issue and what suggestions you might offer to the Chief Metzger on how to achieve that in Pasco. So Chief, if you could just.
Sure. Real quick. We do several things, actually. We have school resource officers in each of our high schools and junior highs that interact with the kids. From that, we built a Police Explorer program, most of whom are young Hispanic, male and females. And part of that is through the Boy Scouts, and part of that is our attempt to get them interested in policing. Some of them do. In fact, we have one young lady right now that's in the process of taking the test. We then have a very active police reserve program. Now, it's not like the one perhaps that you've seen recently in the news. They do not go out on patrol by themselves. They basically are there for special events, working with an officer. But it's also a training ground. There is an academy for that reserve program, and they come out certified by the state as reserve officers, and then they're allowed to work with officers, not by themselves. That also has, out of 15 members, 13 of them are Hispanic, and a couple of those, one of them just took the test to become a police officer. We also have a couple of our explorers that are currently in our local community college, both of whom have told me that they're interested in taking the test. Now, we, of course, are a civil service organization, meaning there is a test, and so we have encouraged, and in fact, the last test was done in Pasco. We have also, we're going to our civil service to give additional points. They haven't done it yet. We're working on it right now to get the Civil Service Commission to award extra points for both being a police explorer and for being a police reserve officer, so that those people that are local and reflect the community can have an extra incentive, if you will, to become members of the police department. So those are the things that we're trying to do locally to increase our, I will say, out of the last test we had about 70 people take the test, and we only had 4 or 5 Hispanics that came in to take the test.
This may come as a surprise, but the National Bar Association is going to caution this commission to believing that residency requirements and affirmative action programs solve the problems that we see in police department. Part of our 25 state initiative that we have against police brutality involves us going into the communities that we're looking at and do know your right forms. And often we do, and we all the time invite the police to come in with us, because the purpose of this is to train the community on how to interact with police departments, educate them on, you get pulled over by a stop, make no sudden stop, sit still. There's certain things you should do and should not do. I will tell you that what has become so disheartening and evident is that some of the most horrific remarks that have been made as it relates to race and the denigration of African Americans have been done by black officers. I was in Arkansas, and the chief of police, who had only been there for less than 6 months, stood up and began to reprimand the individuals in the audience about being involved in the sexiness of the Mike Brown case when they should be taking care of home. He then proceeded to rattle off a name of black on black crime, the things we hear Rudy Giuliani say on the air. And he said that if you want to solve the problem, solve it in your own backyard. But yet he didn't rattle off the 85% of white on white crime, that it is actually going up instead of going down. That's what black on black crime is doing. He then said at the end of his program, get yourself together because I'm tired of scraping your kids off the ground. That officer would have never said that in a white community where we were doing a Know Your Rights. Went to Jackson, Mississippi, where the U.S. attorney is African American, the chief of police, African American, the sheriff, African American, and we were teaching 200 young black men about their constitutional rights. And we give out these little cards that say, here is what the Constitution actually allows you to do. The chief of police, or the sheriff in that area stood up and said, I disagree with everything that the president of the National Bar Association said. If I pull you over to the side, do not begin to litigate your rights to me. You do what I tell you, when I tell you, and how I tell you. And then they pulled over one of my attorneys and they said, why didn't you check her? Why did you allow her to give these cards to these guys? Because when we pull them over, this only makes it worse. In 2015, for individuals to say that the exercising of your rights puts you in the line of fire tells you we have a problem. It's not just loading into a community cops that look like them. It's changing the culture of that community and not putting on the street individuals that don't recognize, contrary to popular belief, police work for us and not the reverse. We have a problem, and it's in that vein that we say, look, I hear cops when they say, and I agree, we do not have a war against police departments. I want the cops protecting my area. I want them protecting my home. We have a war against bad police officers. But what I find ironic is when you tell me not to paint your profession with one brush, that is all they do to the African American community, especially when it comes to young black men. The chief of police in Arkansas say we police harder in black communities because you commit the most crime. But he didn't rattle off any other statistics. He wasn't honest about what he said. And so my son is a 14-year-old guy in an honors program. I fear that with his mother being a lawyer and his father being a pastor with a doctorate degree, that he could walk out into the street and he could look at someone the wrong way, and I no longer have my son. So I don't come to you just as the president of the National Bar Association. I come to you as a mother of 4 with one son, telling you this is a real problem. Don't just load the community with people that look like them, but the real color issue is blue. Black and white makes it worse. But when a culture says, you obey me, you are subject to me, we're dealing with a systemic problem. And we don't like to have the hard conversations, but this is a matter of life and death. And that's the issues. It pains me to have to say these stories, but these stories are true. Not what someone told me, what I experienced as I went from state to state to state to state. Do not reprimand us and think all of us are criminals. All of us are. So you don't paint a community. And when we move away from that narrative that say every black male, and so if you look at the report we gave you, it lists out a lot of mental health patients that they automatically believe because they're African American, something's wrong with them. The reason we focus on African Americans is because African American men are 9 times more likely to be shot by the police. So if the least of us are valued, then the most of us will be respected.
Any other comments from the other panelists? If not, Commissioner Achtenberg?
I had 2 things I wanted to ask Ms. Means about. You, in your statement, you talk about the establishment of independent prosecutorial bodies in cases involving allegations of police misconduct.
Yes.
Could you talk at greater depth about that? And could you identify any places where that approach has been taken and what has been the result of that approach? First, and then I have a second question for you as well.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. What we are recommending is not the establishment of police review boards. We're actually saying that state's attorney's office should have an investigation department within the state's attorney's office, and that those investigative bodies should do the investigation, and the state's attorney should handle the investigation, something similar to what was being offered here in New York. The only department that we know that's similarly doing this is in California. What you guys should know is that our initiative is really chaired by two individuals. One gentleman is a 28-year veteran prosecutor with Alameda County in California. He's the second highest ranking individual. And the other gentleman is a 23-year guy who actually represents families. And the reason for that is because we want the balance of opinion. And this prosecutor said to me, that's where you really get you can assure that there is no bias, because the state's attorney's office is not connected to that local prosecutor. The local prosecutor has the choice and makes a deal, and we have talked to many prosecutors who are now judges on the bench, and they said, Pamela, when we decide what kind of indictment we want, a true bill, no true bill, we present the case in that manner. And sometimes we work very closely with the police department, so it's a trust issue. The only county, and it's kind of untested, is in California. But the reason we're saying this is that we really do believe that there are some places around the country that probably could investigate themselves. But the trust is so damaged at this point that you need an independent body. And police review boards are too susceptible. And if you look around the country, even in St. Louis City, in St. Louis County, even if you gave them authority, the possibility of people choosing the right people, because folks are going to complain either way, but if you give it to the state's attorney, you establish, and this wouldn't require a state to use a lot of money, you set up that individuals to do the investigation, and we believe that that then has put some barrier between the police department and the local entity. You will know that in these cases, that's the reason the National Bar Association has always called on the U.S. Department of Justice to do it, because we wanted to say that if an outside agency is looking,
Sure,
it could bring some credibility.
that's very helpful. The second issue I'd like you to address, you said there should be mandatory racial bias training. I'm assuming both related to explicit bias, but even more importantly, implicit bias. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and are you aware of programs that your members in the National Bar Association either think work or have been proven to improve approaches? If you could address that issue,
And Commissioner, you hit right on it. It's more implicit bias than it is the overt bias.
Sure.
Those biases that we own and have that sometimes we don't even know that are there, that we don't even know we have a propensity to do it. You know, when I got married, my husband said, you know, your mother was strong, and she was a strong woman, but she kind of reared you not to like men. I go, what are you talking about? And because I would make the statement all the time, I don't need a man to survive, right? And so in that, he had the feeling then of he was unnecessary. And some of my actions then led to that. So that was something I had to deal with, that I thought this is a strength, this is something that's great, and it is. But on the other hand, having that partner is a great thing. If you look, I don't know if you saw the announcement that just came out by U.S. Attorney Harris. They're about to start an implicit bias training program in California, because of the systemic problems that are there. What we saw is that the Oakland Police Department was under what? They was under federal review for how many years? And they still have a load of problems. And now they're moving to the implicit bias training, because people are recognizing that as a nation, we have failed to deal with the elephant sitting in the room. And that elephant is race on every level. And what we have to use that training to do, Commissioner, I don't think it's been tested anywhere. I think California is the first place to say, we're going to do it. And the police department is saying, we're going to do it. Now, we have little pockets. If you look in L.A., Connie Rice is doing community relation building, where she has a department that you get points if you de-escalate a situation as opposed to escalating a situation. All of that is nice, but our problem at the National Bar Association is with that we don't don't have time for you to do all of those little pockets of changing. And that's why we're saying implement some of these things with implicit bias training that would weed officers off the street. Because the police chief said to me, well, what do we do, Pamela? We don't want to penalize these people. And I said, don't put them on the street until they're ready. And the implicit bias training would do that. And we have to not then release the test and then have techniques and tools of how to pass the test or training on how to pass those tests. Sure. I was stunned and shocked when I went on the internet and there were tests of how to pass the psychological test for policing. That's not the nature of what we should be doing.
Thank you.
Commissioner Narasaki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also do want to appreciate both Mr. Alexander and Mr. Metzger for coming to this kind of hearing, because of course the lens is very much on the profession in an uncomfortable way. So I appreciate that, because I think you are very key to us really understanding what change is going to make a difference. I was struck by the discussion about how much we are asking police to do these days, particularly in the area of addressing mental health, given the lack of resources that are in society to help address from the health standpoint of the issue. I feel like police are sort of like public school teachers, right? We're asking them to address all the challenges that society throws up and not necessarily giving them all the tools. I also recognize the reality that it's also happening at a time when there's actually less money in local budgets to do all the training, to hire enough people so that you could have training days and still have people out doing what they're supposed to be doing. What thought has been given, and I say this to all the panelists, of really trying to build the political will and the public support for the resources that are really necessary, I think, for us to do the kind of change that is going to be called for, that everybody's asking for. And have you seen that work in some communities? I was very interested when I read, I think it was the PERF report, where a lot of police chiefs, in fact, were saying that they welcome DOJ investigations because it actually helped them have more leverage over both any labor issues, union issues they might have, as well as creating the public will to say, okay, we really actually need to pay for this training, for good quality training, not just check the box training, and have enough officers to really do community policing the way it's supposed to be done. So I just wanted some response on that.
So I'll respond and give Chief here a break, if you don't mind.
I was giving him something happy to talk about.
Yeah. So let me say this first. You know, it's very important that community support police, even in spite of the very challenging times that we're experiencing now across this country. It certainly is asking a lot of many Americans to still have a sense of confidence in their police department. But I think it's important to not forget as well, too, that we still have to coexist. Community needs police, police community needs community. There's a lot of work that is that had not been done in the past, and based on a lot of history, as I noted from the onset. But here's my thought about it from a number of different perspectives, and one being having been a chief in 2 cities in this country. And it becomes important for us in policing, for all of us in policing across the country, to have that community support. For an example, let's talk about mental health for a moment, because what we are beginning to see and what we have seen over the last number of years are these negative confrontations between police, and particularly those who may be having a mental health experience. And many of them have been very negative outcomes that have presented us with ways maybe of not to do things when we look at them on video. So in light of the fact that during the mid and late 1980s, there was a deinstitutionalization of individuals who were typically incarcerated, or should I not say incarcerated, but who were housed in mental health facilities with the onset of new medication, a lot of people are allowed to go back out in the public, but it required also that they would have to have some social supports to help to maintain a place of residency and also stay on on their medications as well too. But oftentimes we know many of these people are homeless who struggle. Many of them may not have the type of social supports that they need to get off medication, and then you have these events that occur between police and community. What we have done in DeKalb County, Georgia, because most recently we had a shooting, as many of you may have heard, of a naked man by one of our police officers. That was in DeKalb County, Georgia, and that case is under investigation by an outside entity, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And I'd certainly be willing to speak more about that as it relates, Commissioner, to your question around should outside entities investigate, and I can talk at length about that. But what we are doing now, the state of Georgia only required our police academy recruits to have 4 hours of mental health training, 4 hours. And you'll find in most states across the country, the mental health training is very minimal. What we have employed post that shooting, in fact, what we had already began to talk about prior to that shooting, we've enhanced all our training now to 40 hours of mental health training. Not to just check the box, but to really have good mental health training for all recruits that are coming in.
And how did you build support for the funding to be able to do that?
Well, we're not getting in an additional funding to do it, quite frankly. We see it as a necessity. We have 6 months of police academy, and we have a little room in there where we can add and take away training as we want to, so we're going to move some other training around because we see this as being a priority. And we're going to add an additional 40-hour or 1 week unto that academy training because we see the importance of it, and we also notice too that many of the calls for service that are going out in our community of over 700,000 citizens, a lot of those calls have some mental health component.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that you've made it a priority. I'm just trying to get at the issue of whether, in fact, society needs to do more in terms of funding in order to address this, and if we do, then what do you do in the reality when both the federal and local budgets are not heading up and they're heading down? But I do have two more questions, and one is we are going to have Heather McDonald from the Manhattan Institute on a later panel, and I wanted to ask Ms. Means, because you brought up the issue of, the what some people often raise in this situation is there are fewer black people being killed by white cops than black people killing black people, so I would love to hear your response to that. And the other thing is, and perhaps one of you gentlemen could reach this, is so oftentimes we see the hero cops who rescued someone or in a highly stressful situation shot a bad guy or something like that. But I don't think we really see very many people, or at least I'm not aware, and maybe it's happening, people being lifted up because they've done really good community policing, because they have de-escalated a situation that might have otherwise gone bad. And I'm wondering what the role is in terms of we've talked about some of the sticks. What are some of the carrots? Are there, in fact, any effective carrots that will help us to change the policing culture, as many of the panels have already noted we need to change?
I can start with that one. One of the things that we do in my department is, and you're right, it's easy to think about discipline all the time, very hard sometimes to think about those other good things. We do a yearly awards ceremony where we do recognize those officers that do those things that, quite frankly, don't make the press. We try to get the press there. They usually don't want to come because that also doesn't make the news very much.
Do they get nominated by the community? Or?
Nominated sometimes by the community, sometimes it's by their fellow officers, sometimes it's by a supervisor. We also do it for residents. We just had some awards go out the other day for residents that helped us do some things. In this case, they caught some burglary suspects that had run by their house. So we do it on either a as-need basis, in other words, as things come up, but then we also do a formal awards ceremony where we do it. And it's not about the shootings or any of those things. It's about just the things you're talking about. And I think that's the kind of culture that it's, as a police chief anyway, it's imperative on me to make sure that we emphasize that, if not more, at least as much as we do the discipline part of it. We have the rules and regulations, all the other things, but it's that good police work, and that's instilled not only in our quarterly, in our daily meetings that we have with supervisors, the daily roll calls, but then those other events such as the awards ceremony. And I think that's incumbent to constantly reinforce that with our staff.
And let me add something to that as well, too. You know, in as much as I think we still do a lot of great training that end up with a lot of good results that you don't hear about, that you just heard the chief articulate, is no, it doesn't get the kind of notoriety as something going wrong, horribly wrong, and have bad optics to it. No, it does not. So what we do, we try to encourage, enhance, make that as visible as we can within the communities, within the police department. And you can have a very good department that do wonderful things, and that doesn't get recognized. Okay, that's okay. I can live with that. The challenge becomes for any administrator, and I think the chief and any of us would agree with that, would be that when one department do something wrong on the other side of the country, it's a reflection now upon all of us. And when that happens, those police officers who are doing a great job oftentimes do get that same stroke of that brush. And they may have had a history of just having a great career, doing wonderful things, saving lives that they can go back to. But that's the nature of the business. We come to accept that's what it is. When we do something great in Washington State, we all herald over it. We do something bad in DeKalb County, we all are saddened by it. That's the nature of it. But it does have its challenges, is when you're trying to keep up with the morale of your men and women, and there are those who go wayward. It does cast a reflection on everyone.
Let me tell you one thing the National Bar Association has done. We applaud those officers who have used de-escalation of force training, and we actually present and show that as a demonstration of how real policing should be done. In addition, I had 7 minutes, but a part of what we say also is I've also sat on panels with very excellent police chief. Chief Ramsey out of Philadelphia is one of the finest I've seen. And his approach to this issue is to acknowledge from the beginning, we have problems, and here are my challenges in dealing with my problems. Now, Pamela, help me try to figure out a solution to that. He comes not with a defense and with his backup, but he comes with an understanding of knowing the relationship is broken. And I've met those, and we have highlighted those among the African American community, and have encouraged our affiliate chapters to work as partners with them. In terms of the funding, we've asked local governments to use the forfeiture fundings that is just sitting there not doing anything that they can allocate and utilize. And that's what we're saying to the Justice Department. There's money you got from the bank failures and stuff that you could direct towards some of this governmental thing. You pay as the racial profiling bill on the federal level, and you say, well, we can't apply that to the local department. Sure you can. You give grants to them all the time that is dealing with policing. You can tie to that a mandatory for them to adopt your federal standard, and then make it be just like you did with racial profiling, a mandatory de-escalation of force that attaches those forfeiture funds to that. Because I agree with you, money is scarce, but we have to find a way to fund what we're doing. Somehow North Charleston found the money now to do all the cameras. What is valuable to us, we find a way to do it.
So I'm going to now go back to Commissioner
Wait,
Cladney.
can she reply to the Heather McDonald question?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Sorry.
The question of the race?
Yeah.
Give me the question again.
So the argument is the issue is not white cops killing blacks, but it's blacks killing each other.
Well, that's comparing apples to oranges, and let me tell you why, or apple to a peanut. Because there is no African American I know, when it's black on black crime, who is paid to protect and serve, that's their job, who is paid to actually, in that situation, to protect that person. Secondly, I've never seen an African American be given 48 hours to get his story together in a situation like that, or escape prosecution by saying I feared for my life. Those are two different situations. A law enforcement officer is given the right and the authority and justifiably under the law to take a life. So you cannot compare someone who is commissioned and hired to do that to someone who is a civilian. And when you make that conversation, talk about the 85% of whites who are killed by whites. And then you're talking about a common conversation, because you're comparing something to nothing. Because I've never seen an African American male shoot another one and not go to jail for it, unless somehow he went to Cuba. I just haven't seen it.
Okay, Commissioner Cladney, you have questions, and then we're going to conclude with questions from our Vice Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Means, I actually think that Ms. McDonald is going to testify that because there is so much black-on-black crime, that police have more interaction and therefore more problems arise where they have to use deadly force.
Well, but my
I'm just
argument,
saying.
no, I understand what you're saying, but if that is the case, then black-on-black crime is actually going down. If you look at FBI statistics, the latest you have is 2001. It went down from 92 to 90. White-on-white crime is going up 85%. So if that's your rationale, then you should be more in white communities making a force on that. But when you look at those numbers, what they say is, well, not all white people are out killing white people. That's the justification on that side.
Chief Alexander, Chief Metzger, I have a couple of questions for you. Police departments are quasi-military organizations, and a lot of officers believe that each officer has to have their own each other's backs, and they are brothers. And when it comes, before there's big problems, there are little problems. And can you discuss a little the problem of being a chief and supporting your men at the same time trying to discipline them according to like progressive discipline rules, things like that, when you have people who dress together in the locker room? If that's a fair question.
No, it's a very fair question, and I think to try to minimize the fact that there is not a brotherhood or sisterhood that exists would be wrong. It does exist. Anytime that you have people that work together in any occupation, quite frankly, it is just normal that you're going to have gain some emotional or psychological relationship with them. If you and I rode in a car every day for 8 or 10 hours on a shift, and we have a variety of experiences that we come in contact with, and we're doing the job right. We're doing the job the way we were trained to do. We don't even have the biases that may exist among others. We're just good police officers, well trained, maybe even live in the community in which we serve. Yes, there's going to be a development of relationships that people are going to have, but it does not mean necessarily they have to be unhealthy relationships, because if you see me do something wrong, you have a responsibility to tell me I'm not with that. And I also have a responsibility not to put you in a position where you ever have to jeopardize yourself or your career for me as well either. Those relationships do exist in policing. Those are not the ones that we hear about more frequently, because we do know that there are unhealthy relationships. We have people who do lie and cover for each other. That do exist. And I, myself, as a chief, as a public safety director over the years, have always been supportive of my folks, but I am very clear about this, that if you go outside of the law, you can expect the same thing you would expect from anyone else. And the same thing that we're out here trying to enforce, we cannot do any different. And you can not only say it, you have to exercise it when those events do occur, and they will occur over the course of your career, because you're dealing with people. Police officers are people that's like anyone else in any other profession. They're going to come with their biases. We train them the very best that we can. We help people realize what their internal stuff is, and some will learn and grow from it. Others will appear to learn and grow from it, and others you will just have to do something else with, more egregious. But I think it's important for any police leader to recognize the fact that anytime you have a number of human beings working for you, men and women, you're always going to have those that are going to go outside, and you have to deal with them appropriately, and that's what good leadership is. Because a lot of this does go back to leadership. There's no question about that. It's what my attitude as the top of the food chain and what's filtered down to the last person hired. And oftentimes, though, the bigger your department, the more challenging it can be. And then sometimes the smaller your department, the more challenging it can be as well, too.
I would echo that and just add to it. I think there's a couple things. We have to, as leaders, show not only we have to lead by example. And I think that's really important. Every new officer I hire, I sit down and talk with for about an hour when I hire them and explain to them what my obligation is, what their obligation is, what my expectation is of them as a police officer. We've had several incidents in the past, as Chief Alexander was saying, there's times during your career you're going to end up disciplining somebody, and I make sure they're very clear that when that happens, that will be done. I've demoted a couple, I've fired a couple, I've had a couple that haven't made it through probation. That's acceptable, and as long as those that want to follow you will, those that don't, they will fall by the wayside. Another key issue to that, for me anyway, is career development. There are a lot of officers that for some reason want to do this job. I'm not sure if I talk them into it or out of it sometimes, but they do want to do this job. So there's career development. They want to become supervisors and captains and managers. And part of that is training them when these things happen. It's your prerogative. You have to come forward. If I find out you don't, guess what? There goes your sergeant stripes, your whatever it may be. So I think there's a couple things that have to be done by us.
Recently in Racine, Wisconsin, there was an article I read, and they've done community policing for about 20 years. And they were a very high crime community at the time. And what they've done is they've actually, I guess, bought houses in neighborhoods. And they have the officers working out of them, not living in them, but working out of them. And it's worked pretty well in regards to community policing. Are there other fashions or ways to do community policing that are effective that you either one of you know of?
There's a number of them. We have a lot of subsidized housing in our city, and so a lot of times if an officer wants to live in one of those subsidized housing, we don't mandate it, but it can be. We try to spread them around a little bit. We used to have a program many years ago, but again, costs being what they were, because they got it rent-free, but then they were expected to live in that apartment complex. And so that was very successful. I know Jackson, Michigan had a very successful officer residence program where they actually lived there, and it was in low-income housing areas, and had a huge difference in that. We did that many years ago ourselves. Now it's sort of an informal thing where if an officer needs to be into transitional housing, for example, we've had several officers that buy and sell homes or move into the area from other departments, let's say, and they'll live in one of those for a while, at least until they get a house. So I think that's certainly something, being part of the community. Some will tell you they don't have to necessarily live there to be part of it. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. I've always lived in the community that I've been a police chief in, even if not mandated, because I feel that's important, at least for me. But rules are what they are in most places. You can't mandate it at this point, but you can certainly encourage it. We do that. For example, we have take-home cars for those officers that live in the city. Those that don't, they don't. That's an encouragement. Some cities, I'm not sure I'd recommend that, but they offer a lower property tax rate to officers that live in the city. There are other things you can do.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'm going to give it now to the Vice Chair to close the panel with her questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This question is for Chief Alexander and Chief Metzger. Throughout our two panels today, we have heard the word trust repeatedly. It's throughout it. And we all seem to agree that in building community relations between our citizens and our law enforcement, trust is an important element of that. We've looked at the report of the task force, and I believe the first pillar talks about trust.
Building trust and legitimacy.
Absolutely. Chief Metzger, when you were speaking earlier about the efforts that were underway in your community to build relationships and to build trust, you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned a program with the Boy Scouts, and you also mentioned the school resource officers. I want to touch briefly on this issue of the school resource officers. In my time as a district court judge in my state, I had a large responsibility for juvenile court, and I saw at that time a few too many instances where I thought that the school administrators were using law enforcement to help them deal with routine discipline. And of course, what I did in the courtroom, I would make mention of that. But over the years, and that was some 15 years ago, but I believe I see, rather than a decrease in that kind of action, an increase of that. And so my question is, what efforts are you in your departments making to ensure that our schools are not calling upon our resources, our resource officers to handle routine discipline? Because when you permit that, it's counterproductive. You're working and encouraging a new generation of folks to distrust and not appreciate our law enforcement. So what are you doing or what can be done to ensure that police departments do not allow their school resource or officers to be misused?
In many departments across the country, and I can go back 25, 30 years when that first concept first came about. I was in Dade County in Miami at that time, policing. And the idea was a good one. Put police officers in the school as a positive role models. You get to know the kids.
Yes.
You work along with them. Maybe you'll do a class or something around promoting good citizenship, you know, that type of thing. But then it moved to something else. And that something else, quite frankly, is exactly what you're talking about, where now what we're beginning to see in many parts of the country, police being used as enforcers as opposed to partnering and mentoring young people along the way. Now, in the 21st century task force document, we attended to that same issue, and what we recommended in there is a reverse back to what that position was originally designed to be, because there has been over time a movement towards being more of the enforcer, which end up doing nothing but we're just helping the school throw kids out of school as opposed to trying to do something, working with those kids in a positive way to keep them in school, and then it becomes a black eye for the police department.
In my past life before I became a police chief, one of my duties at one point in my career was as an SRO. And so I have a heart for school resource officers. And in our case in Pasco, we've had them for longer than I've been there. And we originally brought them in because we had a huge gang problem in our area, high crime rate. They were brought in mainly for the safety of those kids that weren't involved in gangs. Since I've come there the past couple of years, we have been able to, now that the gang issue, at least in the schools anyway, we've been able to kind of moderate that and control it to a great extent. We're now moving back towards what you're talking about. One of the things they do is try to get kids interested in the Explorer program. They try to help those kids. We had one the other day that she was being texted, being bullied through texting by somebody, and she happened to know the school resource. Of course, he's 6'8", so he's pretty easy to see in the high school, and she saw him and sought him out. And this was not a school-related incident. This was actually occurring both in and out of school. So they're really there more for those kids that need that type of help, and we've made it very clear. We have also a written MOU that states right in there, we do not handle the school discipline.
Okay, that's what I
key.
wanted to hear.
Yes.
That's what I wanted to hear, and that's leadership. The law enforcement agency leadership informing the schools that these are the parameters within which we're going to come in and to help, and we're not going to be handling routine discipline for you and you making us the enforcer. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. This concludes our morning session in this panel. Thank you very much to each of you for your participation and your information. We will reconvene here at 1:25, so we ask folks to try to get back here by 1:20 so that they can be seated. Now, housekeeping, any member of the public can purchase lunch at the cafeteria and come in here and eat. Commissioners, we will purchase our lunch and eat in the staff lounge, and our special assistants and staff will join us for that. So we'll be back here at 1:20 for a 1:25 start. Thank you.